Okay, let me introduce our speaker for today. We have Dr. Andy Hicken. Dr. Hicken is the Director of Quality and Strategy at WebCourseWorks. He is an innovator and a creative problem solver with over 15 years of academic teaching and association consulting experience. He brings in a wealth of expertise developing and designing technology for performance improvement, psychometrics, and lifelong learning. Passionate about professional development, Andy specializes in data analysis and leveraging data to help medical societies and healthcare associations map out the next phase for their continuing education programs with effective and scalable solutions. Andy, take it away.
Okay, and I want to introduce my co-presenter today, David Kelly, who's the Executive Vice President and Executive Director of the eLearning Guild. So he's a great person to have here giving his color commentary on this presentation. David has been a learning and performance consultant and training director for more than 15 years. He's a leading voice exploring how technology can be used to enhance training, education, learning, and organizational performance. He's an active member of the learning community and can frequently be found speaking at industry events. He's contributed to organizations including ATD, eLearn Magazine, Lingos, and more. David is also known for his curation efforts, and I know he's presented in this webinar series on that topic, which is a perennial favorite. And he's especially, his curation efforts especially related to conferences and events for learning and performance professionals. I know he shares those on LinkedIn, so I'd recommend you seek out David on LinkedIn and look at the resources he curates there. So David, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. We're going to talk about our e-learning hype curve predictions for 2020. This is a series that we do every year. We also this year did an update in June, so I think we're going to have this. You're going to have an opportunity again to see updates this June. I'll go through real quickly our methods, and then we'll talk about the 4 parts of the hype curve. And I'll define what these terms are for you when we get to that. So the hype curve comes from the consultancy Gartner, which is a technology consultancy out there. They do a lot of great sort of predictions about what's going on in different realms of technology. And they came up with this idea of a hype curve. So the idea is when a new technology comes along, or even not just technology, but I would say this applies to concepts in general. There's an innovation trigger when, basically people don't know what it is. So there's not a lot of talk about it or expectations around it. Then as time goes on, if that technology or concept is compelling, people start to talk about it, they start to get excited about it, and expectations rise. So you see our y-axis here is expectations. And people get more and more excited. They talk about it a lot. There's a lot of hype around the term until the term reaches a peak of inflated expectations, where you could think of, if you go back this far, the hype around the World Wide Web in the 90s, there was a period when everybody thought it was going to, bring world peace and basically solve all of our problems, and it hasn't totally worked out that way. So that then people get disillusioned, and you see their expectations lower until people have really low expectations. In fact, they're often kind of bashing on the technology or the concept. Gartner calls that the trough of disillusionment. And then as people start to actually learn about the technology or concept, it enters a period called the slope of enlightenment, where people no longer expect that that this concept is going to solve all of our problems, but they start to understand what it's for, and then their expectations get calibrated correctly. They have the right expectations for what you would use a given technology or concept for. And once that happens, you enter basically this plateau of productivity where people know what the what this concept is, what it does, and the expectations don't change. So what we do every year is we apply this term to e-learning. So here's our 2019, in other words, last year this time, e-learning predictions hype curve. You can see various terms that we found on the hype curve. At the peak were learning experience and artificial intelligence. Down in the trough of disillusionment, we had MOOCs starting to be reach the slope of enlightenment, and the plateau of productivity were experience API, mobile learning, simulation. So how do we get to this? We have developed a process we use where we pull tens of thousands of tweets from Twitter. So we look at a group of e-learning influencers. Those are the people we're following to see what they're talking about. And in an automated way, using a Python script, we hit the Twitter API and we pull tens of thousands of tweets from them. We then have to go through a long multi-week data cleaning process, and we eventually end up with a giant list of words that are used by these influencers and in the web pages and articles that they've shared. We then analyze that to find the most commonly used words and phrases, and we compare them against a control group of general journalism influencers. So we're trying to say, pull out the hype words that are just general hype, in the culture, and find the words that are specific to the field of e-learning. And after that, we identify buzzwords that we can see in the data are trending up or down. And our central theory is that when expectations rise, you'll see words used more frequently by these influencers, that is. And when expectations lower, you'll see the influencers stop tweeting about them and they move on to other things that are more interesting, exciting. And we look at trends in the usage of those words over time. So we're basically trying to map these words to the hype curve. You might ask who our influencers are. We've been expanding this list. So you might recognize some names in here, or if you're on Twitter, you might recognize some Twitter handles. We started out, I seeded it with a shorter list of people who I follow and know as influencers. And then we wrote a little algorithm that looks at who they talk to on Twitter, and if those people passed muster as being people who talk about e-learning primarily, we added them to our list. So we're up to 61 people. So this is really what you're seeing here is based on the combined tweets of these 61 people and organizations in some cases. So the final product is we come up with this plot that shows you the use of a given word over time. So you've got time on the horizontal axis. This one goes back to December 2017. And then on the vertical axis, you have the proportion of the influencers who used the particular word in a given month. So this is saying right here, this little dot here is saying back in December 2017, you had 7.5% of our influencers used this word, which is digital transformation in the case of this plot. And then over time, just a few months ago, we had all the way up to almost 20% of our influencers use the word digital transformation about 6 months ago. So that's what the dots are. That's a scatter plot. And then we add a line of best fit. This orange line shows you the overall trend. So this is obviously trending upwards over the last, since December 2017, the use of digital transformation. And then there's this smooth curved line, which maybe gives you a little bit better idea of whether the term is peaked or is starting to come down in its usage. I would just caution the smooth curve line is more easily influenced by outliers. So this last dot being low pulls the curve line down. So maybe digital transformation is starting to trend downward, or maybe it'll keep going up next month when we pull the data for that month. So what we're going to do is we're going to move through the 4 phases of the hype curve: the innovation trigger, the peak of inflated expectations, trough of disillusionment, slope of enlightenment. Oh, and the 5th phase, the plateau of productivity, and announce the words we're seeing in each of these phases with the plot for each for each of those terms. And while we're doing this, Adessa, who gave the introduction today, is going to be helpfully chatting out links to articles that we found shared by our influencers about pretty much each of these terms. So keep an eye on the chat too. You'll be able to link out to articles if you want to learn more about a particular trend. So starting with the innovation trigger. So these are the terms that are just newly starting to be used by our influencers. We've seen learning culture trending upwards. So you can see it started out, back in 2017, almost nobody was using this word. Now it's getting close to 25%. Once a term hits 25%, I move it up to the peak of inflated expectations category. So learning culture seems to be getting there, and you can think it's probably in the next year gonna hit that peak hype phase. What's going on with learning culture, this term? The basic idea is that organizations need to develop a learning culture. So if you're a company or some other type of organization that has learning and development, you want to develop a culture where your employees are constantly learning. This is seen as a way for companies to adjust to the pace of change, the increasing volatility that comes from technological change. Organizations want to be sure that their learners are learning on the job, learning new skills, adapting, not just going off the skills they learned before they got the job. That's what seems to be the gist of the articles I saw shared. David, any thoughts from your perspective on how you see people using the term learning culture, why it's started to pick up steam in the last year or so?
Well, I think a lot of it comes to where what it feels like. The idea of a learning culture and the benefits that are promoted around it is easy to get caught up in that. But I think your comment and your comment on where it is and how it's peaking in there is probably spot on based on a lot of what I see, just in the sense of right when you hit the peak is when it starts to get into that trough of disillusionment. And I think when you start talking about learning culture, it makes sense that it would be at about that point, because when you get to the point that so many people are interested in this, saying this is what we need to be doing, this is what we're doing, that's when people start to say, all right, well, how do we do it? And when you don't have the answers to the hows, that's when people start to get a little disillusioned. And I think that in many ways, that's where we're at with this learning culture is, yeah, a lot of people want to do it, but the answers on how to support that within your organization are less easy to find.
Yeah. How do you foster a learning culture within an organization? It's definitely clear it'd be beneficial, but how do you do it? So yeah, I agree with that. I think I'm going to move on to the next trend, because I think these first few are connected to each other in my mind. So we also saw we've seen increasing use of this term future of work among our influencers. And it's not quite to the levels of learning culture, but it's getting close. I found I recommend. I think Adessa will chat this out to everybody. This article from the Atlantic Monthly was widely shared by our influencers, and I think it's pretty interesting. It starts out with an example of the U.S. Navy having a strategy for what they call the future of work. And their theory is that they've traditionally had experts who did expert jobs. You might be the cook, or and you're entirely an expert in how to cook on the ship, or you might have some other more specialized and technical job on the ship, and you're highly trained in that job. But the U.S. Navy is now moving toward a strategy of having hybrid employees who have a main role, but can also pivot to other roles. So the example given in this article is that the cook actually gets up on the deck of the ship and does some of the core operations of the ship when needed on the particular vessel where the U.S. Navy is implementing this approach. So future of work, the idea is that we'll need to be more nimble as employees. We'll need to be able to adapt new skills quickly and be able to perform job functions that we are not trained experts in. We need to be all, do all, and pivot on a dime to solve any problem, is the quote from the article. David, any thoughts on, have you heard people talking about future of work, at the eLearning Guild or with other organizations you work with?
Yeah, it seems like a lot of organizations are focused on this, and on a certain level, it does definitely show promise in my mind, just in the sense of, we're not talking about the future of learning, we're talking about the future of work and what that means for the people in the field of learning. And I think that this is a great article that echoes that, because a big part of it, in terms of how does the future of work affect the future of learning and development, for me, comes down to a little bit in that last sentence there. In a learning context, and in terms of the ability for people to do their work, there was a time, we are shifting away from the time where the person who knew the most was the most valuable person. We've historically worked in L&D in an environment where that, John, who's been here for 30 years and knows everything, is retiring. We got to get all of that information out of John. And that sort of an environment in a workplace, part of the future work, is changing. It's no longer about who knows the most. It's about who can find the answer the fastest. And what does that mean to L&D as that sort of an environment changes, which is why I think you're seeing the buzz around this phrase, future of work, becoming so much bigger in our field.
Yeah, right. Yep, agreed with that. And I wanted to quickly, there was a question that came in from Clark Aldrich. So welcome, Clark. Thanks for attending. And he asked, is learning culture at the peak? Well, I have a rule of thumb I use, which is when a term hits 25%, so if we got up to 0.25 here, that's when I start to think of it as being at peak hype. And I just know from looking at the data, very few terms ever hit 0.25 in terms of their usage. So learning culture looks like it's headed toward that, and it's almost there, but it's not quite there. And we don't know, of course, what's going to happen in the future. It could descend in terms of its usage, actually, and my term for that is fizzlers. In the past, we've had GDPR and blockchain. Those were a couple of terms that looked like they were shooting up toward that peak usage, and then suddenly they dropped off. I think in each case for very specific reasons to that term. So Clark, stay tuned to see if learning culture does in fact hit the peak in our analysis here. All right, so digital transformation. This is another term that seems, looks to be pretty strongly trending upward. Maybe there's a little bit of a drop off in its usage recently. Maybe there are reasons for that. And obviously, digital transformation, this is one of those terms where you wonder why it comes along at this particular moment. Why in 2019, 2020 are we talking about digital transformation specifically? And what I found in digging a little bit deeper into the articles that our influencers are sharing is that it seems to be mostly standing in for automation. So the digital transformation that organizations are grappling with right now is jobs, skills that have traditionally been done by people are actually in practice starting to be replaced by AI. So we're hitting that point where this thing that's been predicted for a long time is actually happening. AI is starting to take over people's actual jobs. And the one other term you see tossed around in these articles is a super job. So that's the idea that you will, just like we were talking about with future of work, people will start to have hybrid jobs where they're moving between different job capacities. They're doing things that they're not experts on. And that will be happening because as soon as you can sort of document the work that an expert does, you can often allow that work to be taken over by an expert system and artificial intelligence. So in my read, we're starting to see these first three kind of trends we're seeing. They all seem to be related to automation, the rise of artificial intelligence in some way. It's e-learning grappling with the consequences of artificial intelligence and automation.
Yeah, and I would add that there's two sides to that equation. the one that most people are always looking at is, how the context of the organization. How is my organization being affected by digital transformation? Because you have to put it in that context. In one organization, it could be a huge factor that radically changes everyone's jobs. In another organization, it may not necessarily be as much of a factor right now, and it might be further down the road. But the flip side that I don't think enough people look at is not just how is digital transformation affecting the workplace that I support, but how is it affecting my role? How is L&D being affected by digital transformation in general? Because that's preparing ourselves for the future of our roles, while at the same time preparing ourselves for the future of the organizations we support.
Yeah, and do you have any sort of projections? Have you seen anything out there in terms of how L&D is being affected by that digital transformation?
There are tools that are emerging that enable us to automate a lot of the processes that are traditionally done manually. And I think that is the lens through which we should be looking for how digital transformation is going to affect not only our organizations, but the work that we do. And I think that's going to be a big part of what we come back to how you connected all these together. The future of work is looking for those opportunities where you're basically asking the question of, is there a way a machine can do this better so that I can focus more on the uniquely valuable aspects that I bring to this role as a human. And I think that's what organizations are looking at in general, and HR and L&D professionals need to be looking at in the work that we do.
Yep, it's kind of that idea that humans can quickly adjust, can be flexible and move between, pick up new skills, develop new insights, and that's basically going to be our main job in the future. That's the idea of the hybrid job, I think. So, okay, and now social learning. So this is another example of a term where you wonder why it's trending now, because I certainly, remember a lot of talk about social learning 10 years ago. But it's also pretty clear that the term is trending upwards. So I dug a little bit into how it's being talked about these days, and in the articles I found, it seems like the meaning, what people mean when they talk about social learning, has changed a little bit. So, from my personal experience, it seemed like 2006, 2008, you were talking about a generation of learning management systems that had discussion forums, maybe some support for people working together as a group on projects and submitting projects together. That was kind of what social learning meant back then. So it was sort of a group experience that maybe was modeled a bit on the emerging social media at the time. Nowadays, it seems like there's a heavy emphasis when people talk about social learning on mentoring and coaching. So more of a one-on-one relationship that is less casual than the social learning of the past. So less, I saw something interesting on a discussion forum and I learned for it, and more like I have a repeated interaction with a mentor or a coach that's personal and that I, obviously learned from, and it's mediated by technology in some sense. That's the sense of that I get of why social learning is starting to trend upwards. David, does that match at all what you're seeing out there when people are talking about social learning?
It does, and I would add another element as well that dovetails on the fact that your data showed it that it rose at one point, went back down, and it's rising back up. Mm-hmm. I think when social learning first started to peak about a decade ago, the conversation focused on the technologies that were available that can connect people in a social context in ways that we've never been able to do before. Mm-hmm. And that led to a lot of, if you build it, they will come type of things that I think led people down the wrong road, and is why the buzz fell. Right. Where I see it rising around now is less about the technology and more about the behaviors. What does it mean to connect with people? What does it look like when people are connecting and sharing in this informal manner? And how we can better support those behaviors, which I think it's the focus on the behaviors today that might be pushing it back up.
Yeah, and that seems like a positive change.
Absolutely.
And maybe it's enabled by the fact that the technology is there in place right now. I mean, I also noticed people talking about technologies like Slack in connection to this. So I think partly, the idea is many organizations now implement something like Slack, some kind of or Microsoft Teams or Skype to enable this kind of mentoring and coaching on the job. So I think that's one reason people are talking about it now too. All right, and then I believe this is the last term, and that's on the still in the innovation trigger phase. So workflow and flow of work have been trending upwards pretty consistently for a while now, and pretty simple idea of making learning available at precisely the moment we need it in our work. And if you follow some of the links Odessa sends out, you'll see that there's a concept of 5 moments of need that are, you can sort of read here, but those are learning for the first time, learning more, applying what you've learned, when things go wrong, and when things change. So the idea is if you're at work and you need to learn something, those are the 5 moments when you turn to your learning resources that are available to you. And yeah, that's the term as I understand it. You see it used in discussion of learning experience, which is in the next section of this presentation.
Yeah, and it's interesting that how sometimes the buzzwords work in our industry, and we're not unique in it. I think a lot of industries do this. I've always said that I hate buzzwords, just in the sense of I find the way I define a buzzword is that it's a term whose usage is spreading faster than its understanding.
Yeah.
Workflow learning and this flow of work thing is a bit of an example of it, because it's a new term that we're using, but it's a new label that we're applying to something that's been in existence for decades. Mm-hmm. Whether you're calling it performance support or workflow learning, or in some cases, depending on the context of how it's used, microlearning. We'll talk about. I know we're going to talk about that in a little bit. They're all talking about this idea of giving people. The way I used to define it when I was in organizations was, what's the least disruptive way that we can solve this problem for someone? And that is very much what's in here. What I think is driving a lot of the buzz today is the fact that it's not L&D driving this as much anymore. This idea of getting workflow learning in there, it's organizations, and they're not using our jargon and describing it as workflow learning. They're embedding the ability for people to solve their own problems into the applications and workflows that people are doing, and it gives us the ability to tap into that energy and do it ourselves. So I'm hoping that we will be able to push this idea of less disruptive learning solutions forward as part of this buzz in ways we haven't been able to before.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and I agree with you. It sounds a lot like performance support from decades ago, and it sounds not that that's an outdated term or anything like that, but that was kind of the term the first time I encountered this sort of idea. It sounds a lot like microlearning too. But yeah, I think that change of having the learning more embedded in the applications seems to be what's going on. All right, so we're now at the peak of inflated expectations. So just like you were saying, David, the whole problem with buzzwords is that they hit a phase where everybody's talking about them and nobody knows what they mean, and that's when you often get inflated expectations around a term. So it seems like it will do everything, solve every problem. And as I mentioned, I think terms are getting toward the peak of inflated expectations when I see them used more than about 25% of the time. So it's interesting that podcasts has hit that level in recent months to me. So I think this was in part, people have their own podcasts. Our influencers appear on podcasts, and they have their own podcasts. But it got to the level where it's pretty clear that it's also seen as an important trend within e-learning. So, what is a podcast real quick? Obviously, a podcast is started out as a program that you could subscribe to, like an audio program you could subscribe to and listen to on your iPod. So that was the original origin of the term. And that, although we use fewer iPods these days than we used to, we still refer to these repeated audio programs as podcasts. And I think one reason they're trending upward in terms of popularity is that they've become easier to access, now that we have smartphones. And I think what is getting our e-learning influencers excited about is that podcasts are accessible. They're easy to get to. They are periodic. They're episodic, so that means that they're an example of spaced learning, which is something that a lot of our influencers believe is a good thing, to sort of get a measure, dose of learning that's easy to absorb, and then kind of repeat that. That seems like what podcasts do. They're audible, but they're invisible. So simply, you can listen to them without having to look at them, and that means podcasts are accessible when you're driving, you're on the train. You can listen to them while you're at the grocery store, that kind of thing. So they're easy to fit into your life. Learn a little bit in times that would otherwise maybe be kind of boring when you weren't learning. So they seem like they're sort of spaced micro-learning. I think that's what is getting a lot of our influencers excited.
Yeah, and I would agree based on what I've observed about where this is in terms of the peak of inflated expectations. The other thing that I would add to it is that they're very they're buzzy. I mean, they're buzzy in the entertainment industry. Everybody's got a podcast. Everyone likes to listen to podcasts. The challenge, and I like the fact that you've put in this slide specific elements of what the unique value of podcasts is, because I think the challenge that people have with podcasting, and at least in terms of what I've seen with a number of people who've implemented them in the past, is they're cool and people like them, so let's try a podcast. And that's different than starting from the place of the podcast is going to solve this unique problem within our strategy, or it's going to plug this unique hole in terms of what we're trying to do, or people would naturally gravitate towards it for this particular reason.
Mm-hmm.
If you're starting from a place of doing a podcast because it would be cool and lots of people doing podcasts and might get us more attention, it might push you further. You might be disappointed in the type of value that you're going to get from it on the back end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know that I've seen examples of technology platforms that are trumpeting their ability to do podcasts as a feature. Is that a trend that you've noticed, David?
It absolutely is. I mean, there's no question that there's interest in podcasts in general. I mean, I often say if you want to see how technology is going to change how we learn and how we produce learning, follow the trends on how technology is changing how we live and how we consume content. So there's no question that podcasts are definitely trending and very popular on the consumer level, which is why there's interest in it on the L&D level. And you see it plugged into a lot of platforms in general, and a lot of unique platforms that pop up that can do this all the time. The other reason I think it's also very popular is you don't need a dedicated L&D based platform, or you don't need to have it in there. It's very easy to generate a podcast with free or low cost tools that are available for you today.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I should mention that one part of our process is one part of our data gathering and process, and then our analysis, is that there's a statistical test to see if a term is used more often by our e-learning influencers than by the control group of journalists. So we're definitely seeing podcasts talked about more often by e-learning influencers than by journalists, which should tell you that they are, given that journalists also appear on podcasts and tweet about their podcasts and that kind of thing, that tells you that this term is definitely buzzing among e-learning influencers. Mm-hmm. Okay, so hype per month for learning experience is still really high. So here's my 25% cutoff line. That's this line right here. And you can see learning experience has been above that line for most of the last year, and well above it. So this is one of the highest rates of usage of any term by the e-learning influencers. So I recommend that you check out Josh Berson's articles. He coined the term learning experience. I define it as a more enticing learning platform with a focus on a modern user experience, adaptive learning features, and a micro-learning orientation. Or you could say he uses that term flow of work that we saw earlier in identifying what the point of a learning experience platform is. And I can tell you, as a company that's in the business of having a learning management system, that learning experience has been a really important marketing term over the last year or really a couple of years for learning management platforms. So it's certainly affecting the design of learning management systems and also how they're marketed. Yeah, so what are your thoughts,
Well,
broadly,
and I
David,
think
on learning experience and learning experience platforms?
your comments were interesting because a lot of some of the particular points you made fit right into my thoughts, which is, I think you used the phrase, Josh Bersin put this term out there. I define it this way. I think if you went out to all the influencers that are out there that are using this term and asked each one of them individually, if you had 50 of them, 60 of them out there, you asked all 60 of them, how do you define learning experience? You'd get 60 different answers, which is part of the challenge that I think exists around learning experience. The idea of focusing on what people are doing rather than what we're doing to create the content, I think is very valid and extremely powerful. But if we don't get some level of clarity around what we mean when we talk about building a learning experience instead of building a course, what's the differences between those two, and what's the value proposition of learning experience design as a separate part of design, I think that's going to be critical in order to really harness the potential of this particular term. And I do think what does give me hope in that regard is your comments on some of the platforms that are out there. The platforms in many ways are helping drive the clarity around how the industry is going to define learning experience based on the types of new opportunities for learning that they are building and enabling through the technologies that they're creating.
Yeah, and I would just say that to me the most valuable thing about it is if you look at the two terms, learning management system and the learning experience platform, a management system suggests the top-down paradigm for learning, so you are managing the learning of the learners. And a learning experience platform suggests that it provides a platform for people to have learning experiences on, so it's more of a bottom-up approach and a focus on the experience of the learners. So I guess that's a valuable thing about it, about this.
You did also touch on the fact that it's a very popular marketing term, and I always give people caution on this, just in the sense of the same way I used to say it's not a phrase that's as relevant anymore. We tend to call ourselves learning professionals. We used to call ourselves training professionals. And just because you change your business card from training professional to learning professional doesn't necessarily mean anything about what you do has changed. It's the label is one thing. So just because I'm going to say that this platform enables learning experiences rather than managing learning content doesn't necessarily mean much unless there's actually different functionality attached to it. So don't just go out and buy a learning experience platform. Look and see what sort of functionality those platforms are delivering, and are they solving problems for your organization? Get into the weeds of what it is. Don't just buy something based on the use of a buzzy marketing term.
Absolutely. That's a great segue to our next term. So virtual reality is also at peak hype levels, maybe starting to trend downwards a little bit. So you can see, the last few months have been a little bit less usage of the term virtual reality. I think that what's happened is the VR technology has become a little bit cheaper and more well-known. There are more solutions out there. So we're starting to get to the phase of application. And I say application to some classic e-learning use cases, like, for example, diversity training in the case of this article from Forbes. So the whole theory of the hype curve is when a term enters the period of application, that's when you start to see people complain about it and start to get a little bit disillusioned. They thought it was going to solve lots of problems, and it turns out it doesn't solve as many problems as they thought. I think that's virtual reality is starting to reach that phase.
Yeah, and I think VR is a good example of a challenge that we sometimes have in our industry around the lens through which, for lack of a better term, that we look at these technologies. VR, we sometimes look for the silver bullet, the one tool that's going to rule them all, if I can use my Lord of the Rings reference. That is going, I'm going to be able to do everything I possibly need to do through this. And if you look at technology like something like VR through that lens, it is never going to deliver upon that value. VR is a tool that is going to have a very narrow use case of problems that it can be solved, but it's going to be a use case that is so powerful that until the technology advances where AR, VR experiences can be delivered through the same technology, VR can deliver a powerful learning experience that no other tool can do. I mean, but if we have to look at it through that lens. I remember the first time one of the first VR experiences I went through was the ability to learn about space from Neil deGrasse Tyson, which was kind of, you know, between the technology of VR and my geekiness on learning. So I like space and I like Neil deGrasse Tyson. It was like a trifecta of my interests. And then I put it on, and I was in a theater, a virtual theater, and suddenly an avatar in the front of the room of Neil deGrasse Tyson walked in, and he was standing in front of a screen, and he put up, and I was like, oh my God, I'm in a PowerPoint classroom. That's not, and I know I was out. I didn't complete the experience because it didn't take advantage of the unique aspects of VR.
Right.
So I do think when you're in a situation with VR and there is a powerful use case of giving people the ability to practice something where the risk of failure can literally be life or death, it is solving a problem that we couldn't solve in any other way. But if we're looking at it as how can I do everything through VR, yeah, it's not going to be a solution for you, and people are going to be very disappointed.
Right, and that's part of the theory of the hype curve is eventually people start to figure out what the term is, what the technology in this case is useful for, and then you see less talk about it, and it's in application. Okay, so design thinking real quick. So this term maybe, you know, I don't know, maybe this month, a few months ago was an outlier, but we still see a general upward trend. So I put this in the, it was over 0.25, so a few months ago, but maybe it has peaked. Maybe this is starting to move downwards toward the trough of disillusionment. And it has a really simple definition. Design thinking, it means you should approach problems the way designers do. And I don't have much more to say about it than that, but you do see if you're looking for some good reading on what people in e-learning have to say about it, this article is a good collection of a good curated collection of resources on that.
Yeah, and it's definitely a term that people throw around a lot. It's very buzzy. I haven't seen any broad mainstream changes to our field as it relates to the discussions around design thinking, but I do find that design thinking is a good term for people to be following to inform the work that they're doing. You know, I don't think that it's going to be a radical paradigm shift in terms of how L&D is done, but I do think as people do their design and development work in our field, following what's going on in design thinking and pulling from that space to better inform the work that we do is a very useful thing to be doing in your own professional development.
Remind yourself that you are doing design, whether you think of it that way or not, and think about whether there are new ways that you could approach the problems that you're faced with.
Exactly.
Okay, so speaking of high levels of hype, AI has been, you know, the most buzzing term over the last couple of years. You can see it's been over 0.25, you know, since we've been doing the hype curve. I think that, you know, David, your warnings about learning experience, that you should really know what you're buying when you buy an AI solution are definitely valuable with artificial intelligence. I think you should read up on artificial intelligence before you invest in it, and you should know what the particular problem is that you're trying to solve in the particular solution that you're trying to apply for it. But broadly, you know, AI is closely linked to machine learning, so it's the idea that instead of a developer or a programmer telling a computer how to solve a problem, that the computer will come up with its own solutions to those problems. And I think my meta comment is that I think it's starting to trend downwards a little bit in terms of the hype, because I think it's entering the period of application. I think you know, people are experiencing it in their workplaces, and they're starting to get see the problems. So you see articles like this one: the world of AI is full of hype and deception. Or you could read this again, Josh Burson article, and you'd see some critical thoughts in that article as well. But certainly, you know, it's probably the most important trend in technology in general over the last 10 years is artificial intelligence. And like I said earlier in the presentation, I think it's also it's having knock-on effects. There are other buzzwords that are related to to the rise and use of artificial intelligence in the workplace and in learning. So, David,
And
that's my thoughts on it.
I love this article, what the top article you have here, the headline of that, you have no idea what artificial intelligence really does, because it echoes where I see a lot of the AI conversation. A lot of people are coming to this conversation as AI as if it's something they have to do, as if it's something they need to leverage in their organization. And while there are some opportunities to do that, it's more about understanding how AI is just changing the environment in which we're working, what AI is doing and how it's going to impact the future of the organizations that we work on and what it does. And I do think that there is a lot of, we're looking at it wrong and we're interpreting it wrong. I like the fact that this article also mentions Sophia on the front of that. When we had DevLearn a couple of months ago, conference in Vegas, we brought Sophia in as keynote. And part of the reason that I wanted to bring Sophia in was to address just that. You know, we had Sophia come in and she gave a speech, and then I came on stage and we had a conversation with it, but then kind of pulled the curtain away a little bit towards the end of it, acknowledged the fact that a lot of what was there wasn't really, we tend to associate this idea with robots, but a lot of what was seen up until that point wasn't really heavily leaning on the AI. The speech was written beforehand. The conversation that we had and the questions and answers were supplied earlier so that there was a level of preparation that was done in advance. And it wasn't until the end where we kind of said, let's do something that wasn't prepared at all so we can really get a better idea of where the AI is kicking in, that you really saw a more transparent view of what the AI component was as compared to the smoke and mirrors, or the impression that is given by the staging of what is often discussed in an AI conversation. So I think we need to understand how AI is just changing the way that organizations work and get a better idea of what that's going to mean from the work that we do.
Yeah, and Clark Aldrich, again, one of our influencers, he chimes in and says AI-supported computer game creation will be necessary for the growth of games in education. Absolutely true, and you know, we work in software development, and AI is a really revolutionary trend in development right now that's changing the way a lot of software works in general. So I'm not trying to say that it's, I think we're just sounding a note of caution in terms of the hype and the marketing surrounding AI, but it will change our lives. I can't agree with that more. So I'm looking at the time, and I think we're running out. We're entering the period of the hype curve where, because things move from left to right, we've talked about these before. So we'll have at the end links to past blog posts where you can read more about these hype curves. So I'm going to start moving a little bit faster in the discussion of these different terms. So analytics is trending upwards and is clearly in the peak hype phase now. I don't think there's too much to say about that either. You know, every learning organization is starting to accumulate more data. That's the nature of our technology, that we have more data these days. We have big data in some cases, so technologies that automatically generate data for us, things like Internet of Things technologies, social media generate much more data than some of the software of the past. That leads every organization to want to have more analysis of the data that they have on hand, and that's what drives the interest in analytics. I think you know, we're getting to the point where people are starting to implement more business intelligence that's specifically directed toward learning organizations. So sometimes you see people talking about learning analytics, and we're at the phase where, because we're starting to get into application, people are starting to realize how difficult it sometimes can be to clean all that data and have it make sense to get it into usable dashboards and other kinds of visualizations. So Clark, chime in if you have anything more to add to that kind of readout on analytics.
Yeah, no, I totally agree on the analytic piece. I mean, I think a very succinct way of putting it is, I think the technology piece of the analytics discussion is mature. It's a question of, are you allowing those analytics and that data to inform your practice?
Great. Okay, so the trough of disillusionment, these will all be terms that we've talked about before. So trough of disillusionment means that the people have started trying to apply the term. It was previously highly hyped, and now we're starting to see less usage of it. So this is just really striking with the term microlearning, where you had our influencers back in early 2018 would be these dots here. We're talking about microlearning quite a bit, and now you see them using that term a lot less often. And that's been the case over the last year. So there's just been this kind of steady decline. So I think we talked last time about what some of the reasons for the decline were in the usage of the word microlearning, like what the sort of inflated expectations that surrounded microlearning. I think, though, there's nothing wrong with the concept of keeping learning small, formatting learning in a way where it can fit into people's lives, and where people can sort of adapt it at the time that they need it. It was just kind of overhyped. So I won't repeat myself too much on that term. We'll just keep going. So gamification is another term that has had a similar trajectory to microlearning. I think it's important to note that gamification is trending downwards in terms of its use. Gamification is a little bit different from learning games. Gamification means you take I think the best definition of it is you take your existing learning and you apply some of the markers of games to that existing learning. So you take your SCORM modules or what have you for your mandated compliance training, and you add things like points and levels and badges to it. That's, you can sort of see what the problem would be there. People are not necessarily going to get excited about that content no matter what. The points and levels and badges are just kind of annoying and manipulative to people. Whereas learning games are something entirely different. That's a game that's designed to teach something to people. And although learning games are not reaching high levels of hype right now, I took a look at them and they are trending upwards. So gamification different from learning games. And learning games are sort of trending upwards and becoming more accessible to people. Badges. So badges are micro-credentials, and there's a technology standard called Open Badges for them that allows those micro-credentials to move between different learning platforms. And there's just been a general downward trend in terms of their use. I think badges have been closely connected to gamification in the minds of most influencers. I think they have great applications for the kind of association continuing education that we're really closely involved with at Web Courseworks, but they're clearly in the application phase. I can see, I go to certain conferences, the American Society of Association Executives, Association for Continuing Education in the healthcare professions, and I've seen presentations there about badges. So they're being applied. They're just not something that people are buzzing about the way that they did a couple of years ago. And then slope of enlightenment. So Experience API is actually now statistically trending upwards. So it kind of hit the trough of disillusionment. It was hyped maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and then it hit the trough of disillusionment sometime in 2017, and now it's getting to the point where people actually know what to use it for. So I think people are starting to realize it's not the replacement for SCORM that it was hyped in originally. It has a different use case involving big data and analytics. And I think that's what's going on here. And then at the plateau of productivity, I just put mobile learning on here. If you look at the last few months, you can see it's pretty much flat. So I think it, was considered a big problem in e-learning, say, 10 years ago, and talked about much. There were technology solutions that came out for it, apps and that kind of thing, mobile responsive learning platforms. So there was a lot of hype then, and then people started to see problems in that. Now we've entered the phase where most organizations that need to have mobile learning now have it. So it's talked about less, and we'll probably just move it off the hype curve in the next iteration because it'll just be stable. Mm-hmm. Okay, David, I breezed through a bunch there. Any kind of wrap-up comments you want to make?
No, I mean the only thing I would add is that the trends are always out there, and it's interesting to to follow them. The issue is not what the trends are within the industry. The issue is how, I always encourage people to say is, what do the trends mean in the context of your own organization? Just because something is trending broadly across multiple areas doesn't necessarily mean that it works for you. And just because something's not trending doesn't mean it doesn't solve a problem for you today. So take what you're hearing here today and put it in the context of your own work and the organizations you're working for.
Excellent. Always great advice. Edess, any questions? We got about 2 minutes here. And I guess, okay, so here's a comment from Clark Aldrich. So he says, I see two patterns here that don't follow the hype cycle curve. The first is terms that gain momentum every few years, such as social learning. Yep, agreed. The second is new technologies that just crash and burn in our space. Yeah, and I'm familiar with that because we've had in past iterations, we've seen, boy, GDPR is trending up really fast, and then it just crashed and burned. In that case, I think it was because there's a legal deadline surrounding GDPR, or blockchain would be another example. So that's the technology behind cryptocurrencies. People in L&Ds, there was so much hype around in general technology about blockchain that people in L&D started talking about it, and they said, "Oh, what are the applications of blockchain in L&D?" And it turned out that nobody really had any ideas. It didn't seem to solve any problems that were specific to L&D. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's something out there that does make good use of blockchain. But in general, it seems like most of our influencers didn't find anything that mattered to them. So yeah, I call those terms fizzlers. And in one of our past presentations, I had a section on fizzlers that looked like they were going to be really important and then turned out not to be. So great meta commentary there, Clark. So you've got links here to the blog posts we've done in the last 3 years. And we have a new web page, a new nicely designed website up that shares our 2020 learning hype curve predictions.
Excellent.
So I guess that's it. So David, thank you very much for joining us here today.
Oh, thanks for having me be a part of it. It was fun.
All right. And that wraps it up, folks. So thanks a lot for attending.
Thanks, everyone.